Let's start with a question. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to listen to it, did it really make any sound? As you understand, this is not just a philosophical question. It's a question about how we know things have happened. Same way, this is a question about life. This is not a course about assessment or measurement or anything else. It's a course to introduce to you the basic ideas underlying our ability to understand whether we manage to make any difference or leave a mark on our world through educational programs. So welcome. My name is Professor Leehu Zysberg. I'm from Gordon College of Education, and this is not a course on assessment and measurement in educational programs. Ready? Let's begin. To begin, we have to understand what we're talking about. Let's define the two concepts at the core of this presentation. Let's begin with measurement. Measurement is an act of conversion. We convert an idea to a quantity or an indicator. In other words, we translate a conceptual reality, an idea, a theory, into something we can sense and we can quantify. For example, suppose I'd like to understand how much does a student know about the geography of Western countries. Eventually, I'll pass or administer a test of geographical knowledge, and the grade would be the quantity. It will be the conversion of the basic idea of knowledge into a measure. This measure will usually contain information about two things: quantity or power, and the direction in which it goes. Another way to look at measurement is through the concept of labeling. This is more relevant when we're talking about qualitative measurement. In other words, we're taking a lot of words, a lot of ideas, a lot of information, and we extract meaning units from it by labeling certain reaction patterns in a way that makes sense or provides meaning to that information. In other words, it's all about understanding and organizing our reality in terms that allow us to extract meaning from it. But when we're talking about measurement, we focus on the process of conversion, of turning an abstract idea into a tangible, concrete indicator. The next idea we are going to talk about is assessment. And here's yet another definition for you. We can relate to assessment as two-winged bird, if you will. One is the process of extracting meaning from measurement or from indicators to draw a conclusion, or look at data in a diagnostic manner to support decision making. In other words, it's the process in which we translate the measurements we have produced into a way of action, a decision, or a diagnosis. Let's see how it works using a very mundane everyday life example. Let's see. So here's an example for you. Suppose I'd like to understand or get a good indication of my immune system function, all right? What I'll do is I'll take my temperature. This is the measurement, right? I'm taking the general idea of immune system function and I translate it into my body temperature. That will be the measurement part. And then when I look at my body temperature, I will conduct an assessment. Is it high enough to suggest that, for example, I have an inflammation, or my body temperature is normal, so no inflammation, I'm healthy. This is the process of assessment. So hopefully by this point we understand conceptual reality, measurement, assessment. All right, let's move on then. Why would we want to bother with measurement and assessment? You may guess that these processes take time, effort, resources, thinking. Why should we bother with this? Don't we have enough on our table already? Well, there are numerous reasons why we want to do it, and that brings us back to the tree in the forest issue. How can we tell if something happened unless we measure it, unless we assess it and draw a conclusion? Our most terrible enemy in scientific-based, empirical-based interventions, educational interventions, is general impression. We conduct a program and everyone is really happy and saying, "Thank you so much, Leehu, for doing this at the end of the day," and so on. I'm like, oh, that was a big success. But how can I say that? All I know that it was fun. Maybe people enjoyed the buffet lunch or dinner. Maybe people enjoyed, the meal break in their mundane daily routine. Did I make the difference I intended to make? That's the question I want to ask myself. So, when we're talking about the purpose for which we measure, we talk about at least 4 items that we need to look at. First of all is realizing what the reality is, if you will, an anchor measurement or assessment, a snapshot of an existing situation or condition. Why would we want this? Well, mainly if we want to change something, we need to start with something. We need to understand there's a problem or a challenge or something is lacking. We need a picture of the before, if you will, in order to reach an after. Then, of course, we'd like to start planning processes based on this information. Eventually, we'd like to intervene or conduct a program, and then of course validate it, show that it actually works, that what we wanted to achieve was actually achieved, partly so, fully so, not at all. It's important to understand what we achieved, and eventually, last but not least, accountability. We have to be able to say we chose this and that program because evidence suggested that it is the most likely to yield the results we're after. Much like any professional will have to stand behind their decision, call they made, or the judgment they took. Like any other professional will be required to be accountable for the tactics they chose, the measures they used, the interventions they applied, and so on. We as educators have to be able to defend and stand behind our decisions. As we are in the scientific domain and we're using scientific methods and tools to promote our business here, we have to make sure that the methods and measures we use are both reliable and valid. These are 2 concepts that are the guide for choosing the right way to assess and measure things. Let's have a closer look at each and understand what they mean. So, let's start with reliability. Reliability is the level of or the extent to which a measure is consistent and stable. Let's assume that I'm measuring my own height, physical height in feet or centimeters. I'll take a measure tape, I'll strap it along myself, and well, let's say I'm 178 centimeters. Then I'll let it slack, try again, now it's 180. Couple minutes later, 177. What's going on? Am I changing my own height? No, these are differences stemming from my posture or the physical condition of the measuring tape and so on. In other words, every measurement, even the most simple one, concrete one, has a component of error in the measurement, inconsistency in the measure. We are hoping that this measure or this level of inconsistency is the lowest possible. The more consistent it is, the more stable it is, the more reliable we can call the measure. So that'll be the extent to which we manage to get a similar result time after time. Validity, on the other hand, is the extent to which we manage to actually measure what we intended to, or in our little graphic analogy, how close to the center, to the bullseye, have we measured or have we managed to get. So, the combination of both, on one hand being consistent and reaching the same measurement or the same area on our target time after time, is one aspect that's very important. The other one, how close are we to the bullseye? In other words, how successful were we in measuring what we intended to measure? The combination of both, of course, gives us the ideal measurement, a measurement that's both valid and reliable, okay? So now that we have established what we need to do and what we need to expect of our measures, what do we measure when it comes to an educational program's effectiveness or outcomes or processes? Well, the first one that we can look at is, of course, has it reached its goals? And when we're talking about academic and educational programs' goals, then we can look at least 3 levels of outcomes or performance. One is knowledge, disciplinary, pedagogical, etc. The next one is skills, know-how, if you will, or what we often call tacit knowledge. And last but not least is attitudinal or motivational outcomes. Do people really want to or are capable of or oriented toward whatever it is that we wanted them to get? Last but not least, we'll also look a little bit about how we assess a project process, if you will, how we manage a process of whatever intervention it is that we're looking to conduct, and how we assess the process as a whole. So that'll be at the end. Let's start with knowledge. We may relate to knowledge gained in training processes as an iceberg. An iceberg in which a small top, a visible, tangible top, can be seen above water, and that's what we call the explicit level of knowledge. It's what we often relate to as declarative knowledge, knowing dates, knowing terms and concepts, being able to recite something, and so on. A formal way of assessing what a person knows. A deeper level of knowledge is what we often term tacit knowledge or know-how, and this has a lot to do with people's skills. This is much more difficult to assess because it looks at not what a person can say or declare or recite, but rather at what a person can do. And it often refers to our ability to actually perform something with a certain level of skill and quality. Both concepts are very important in our understanding of our ability to assess knowledge. We expect people, first of all, to build some kind of a theoretical or conceptual background for their knowledge and skill development. And this, of course, can be tested using various knowledge tests, etc. We'll talk about it soon. But also, we do expect people, especially in specific educational intervention programs, we do expect people to develop certain levels of practical skills to promote their work, to promote certain goals or attainment that we're interested in. And how do we do this? We'll talk about it shortly, soon enough. Perhaps the most common way of measuring knowledge, tacit or explicit, is the test. A test is practically a series of problems or questions aimed at discovering a certain body of knowledge. So we're basically asking ourselves, what are we looking for? What kind of knowledge we're looking for? And then we're presenting items or questions that will require that specific knowledge to be able to answer. We look at the quality of the answers. Now, how do we know if an answer is good quality, not so good quality, awful quality, etc.? Well, a test must have one correct answer, and the extent to which a person was able to identify that answer and provide it is basically our criterion. Now, of course, in more complex situations, and we'll talk about skills, for example, not necessarily each case or each problem will have a single correct answer, but ideally, we're striving at the situation in which each question has a single correct answer, and then we're looking at the extent of which a person managed to identify that answer, pursue it, and reach a correct answer to a question. That's one. Second is the structure of the test. How do we differentiate between different levels of knowledge? Well, two classic types of tests are presented here to be able to differentiate between different levels of knowledge. The first is the speed test. The speed test is a series of medium-range questions. Not very difficult, not very easy. Something that's aiming more or less at the middle range of the knowledge or skill level we're looking at. But numerous questions, a lot of questions, more than a person can answer within a given time frame. And that's on purpose. We're giving this time limitation as means of motivating people to work fast. Now, we're under the assumption that the more the person knows, the more skilled he or she is in resolving such issues, they will be able to answer correctly more questions. Sometimes it's very relevant. For example, when we're talking about skill, we're expecting a skilled person to resolve a problem or to work something out faster and more effectively than a person who's a novice. On the other hand, questions or issues that require philosophizing, thinking in depth, or the exact opposite, thinking of diverse ideas, these may take time, and a limited time frame may not match this measurement. And this is where we come to a different kind of test called the strength test. This test has no formal time limit. What it does have is a slowly rising level of difficulty. So we start with very basic questions, and then as the questions progress or the items in the test progress, they become harder and harder to resolve correctly. And we're looking at the level at which the person stops answering correctly. All right? So no time pressure this time. We're just looking at where does the person's ability or knowledge stop being effective. And that will give us an idea of the level of knowledge or mastery of that knowledge that the person has. Now, how do we know if a person is doing fine or not? So far, I talked about measurement, right? We converted, using a test, we converted knowledge or skill to a test, a measure. But how do we make the assessment? How do we decide this person is doing well, this one's not so well? In this program, 80% of the people reached the goal we set for them. The rest did not, and so on. Well, here too, we have two types of criteria for decision making. One is the absolute criterion. In other words, a person must reach at least a certain expected level of performance or knowledge to pass the test successfully, to be called successful in passing the program or whatever. For example, driving tests, right? You have to reach a certain level of skill in driving to pass the driving test and get a driver's license. Otherwise, you're not considered safe to yourself or the environment, no driver's license for you. However, in some other situations, we do not have an absolute criterion. We have a relative criterion. Then we say, okay, the top 10% are the successful ones and the rest are not. For example, many tests for job acceptance work like this, right? We test the candidates, and then if we need only 10% of these candidates, we'll accept those top 10% or whatever. Same goes in school, right? When we're doing like a GRE examination or GMAT examination or using the matriculation exams as criterion for acceptance into academia, usually what we do is we're asking how many places do we have or how many empty seats we have on our next year or cohort, and then we decide the top 10%, the top 15% of our candidates will be accepted. So two types of criteria for deciding what's considered successful or what's considered satisfactory knowledge, skill. One is the absolute criterion, the second is the relative criterion. So now we know, let's move on. The next type of outcome we'd often measure when assessing educational intervention programs are attitudes and motivations. Now, what am I saying by this? Many of the motivational aspects of learning are so important that some interventions and some educational programs are aimed specifically at that, changing people's attitude towards other people, towards certain vocations and professions, the motivation to pursue science, mathematics, etc. So in many cases, our educational goal is not necessarily knowledge or skill, but rather an attitude or a motivation change. So how do we measure this? And why do we bother looking at attitudes and motivations? Well, the answer to the second question is quite easy. It's because for many, many years, attitudes are considered one of the most important components in predicting behavior. In other words, if we understand people's attitudes, we can predict within a certain level of, margin of mistake, their behavior. So that's a way to, in more or less general terms, predict and influence, maybe even shape people's future behavior. And that's, of course, very important. Think about educational programs to change dietary consumption, right? Eat healthier. Save the environment, and so on. All these are attitudinal, focused intervention programs. So have we managed or not managed to change attitudes? To understand this, of course, we have to understand what attitudes are. So let's look at the structure of an attitude. Attitude is basically a component or a corpus of different reaction patterns we have toward objects and subjects in our lives. And they're made of three basic components. The first one is the emotional reaction. How do we feel about that object? The second is the cognitive aspect or reaction. What do we think and know about that object? And last but not least, our behavioral tendency toward that object. How do we usually behave toward or away from that subject, target, idea? Let's use a simple example, okay? Chocolate. I love chocolate. Now, you already know what's my emotional reaction toward chocolate, right? I'll like chocolate. If someone takes chocolate away from me, I'm angry with them and I'm very sad and so on. And that's the first reaction pattern, how I feel about chocolate. Then what I think about chocolate. Well, I think it's healthy for me. People say that, they often publish various studies showing that chocolate is good for your mood. If consumed moderately, it's also good for your immune system. So I'm very happy, not just about chocolate, but I'm also happy to know that it's good for me. Then behavioral intent. What do I do in the presence of chocolate? Well, I'll try to get myself as close as possible to it and basically eat as much as I can. So here's my attitude toward chocolate. And of course, it makes it clearer why I believe, once I understand one's attitude toward chocolate, I will also understand how he or she are going to behave when there's chocolate around. All right? So, silly example, but I hope you understand that this can be easily applied regarding any subject that we'd like to develop and push forward through education. Gender equality, politics and democratization, personal choice, sexual behavior, whatever you decide, right? We can gauge and understand people's attitudes toward these subjects. And of course, when we measure them, we have to have a structured measure that relates to all three components, right? What people feel about that object, what people know and think about that object, and how they tend to behave in the presence or when they think about that object. Last but not least, I've talked about looking at the assessment of educational program and intervention program as processes. And this is important, of course, because every and any education program is actually a project that needs management and needs leadership and needs control and, of course, hindsight. Did we do well? What could we have changed? What could we have improved? How can we make it better next time? What have we achieved and what is lacking? And so on and so forth. So looking at the educational program, not just in terms of results, and we talked about knowledge, skills, attitudes, and motivations, but now looking at the process of educational intervention is very important. I'm going to look into two very popular models that serve as means of or as tools for both developing and assessing projects in education and outside of education. Let's have a closer look at that. The first model that I'm going to present to you is called the critical path diagram. Basically what it says is the following. A project, any program, can be broken down into major junctions or major events. For example, design, then trial, then marketing or calling people in to participate, then running the series of events, then test or final project or discussion or whatever, and then finalizing the project, looking at the outcomes. When we're looking at these components, we draw connections. As you can see, we draw lines or arrows leading from one component to another, thinking about how much time and effort each stage is going to take, which stage is leading toward a next one. Can I jump between one stage to another? Are there certain stages without which the whole projects will fall down? And these will be the critical path. And I can measure and assess, not just plan, but once I've planned it and I got that map, I can assess which of the critical paths were followed correctly, which points were reached successfully, which points were missed or omitted or jumped over. Then I can tell how well the process ran and how effective it was. Did I lose time? Did I waste resources? Did I miss a critical path that eventually led to inefficient outcomes? So this is a great way to draw a process, follow it on, and see whether it was implemented correctly and on time. And if not, if something happened, if there were mistakes, omissions, etc., where did these breaks in the system take place? When and where? Another very popular Another very popular tool is called the Gantt chart. Probably the most popular way of presenting projects in the industry and in education in general. It gained its popularity because it's very easy to understand. Basically, you create a list of all the tasks and all the stages you have to conduct on one end of a table. Then you spread it on a calendar with dates, times, days, years, whatever it is that you need to take a timeline for. And then each task is marked in a different color or a different pattern to represent who does what and when. And then you can follow it. It's a roadmap that allows us to say, okay, did the person who needed to do that actually did it? Did they do it on time? Did they do it with collaboration or coordination with other events or activities that needed to take place at the same time? And so on and so forth. This one also provides us with a level of understanding personal performance within the system, not just how the system worked. It provides less information about critical points in the process. We don't know from a Gantt diagram which one's more important than the other or which one leads to another. It allows us more to follow personal performance in each task by different people and collaboration or coordination between different tasks. Both systems have their ups and downs, have their advantages and disadvantages, of course, But basically both allow us to follow a process. Was due process followed? While it provides a lot of advantages, of course, an ability to control and understand processes, both systems, actually every system I can think of when it comes to project management, has little attention paid to the actual quality of performance. And this is something I have to bring up as sort of critique on these approaches to process management. I can say who did what, I can say if things got carried out or not. There's a lot of emphasis on timelines. Were things done correctly on time? That's okay. But if things were done well or half-heartedly, I cannot tell. Not using these measures. There are other measures which help doing this, but not these. But you know, nothing's perfect, and this is also one way of looking at, or just two examples out of many that help us follow on projects, not just as means of did our program work or not, did it achieve its goals or not, but how was it run, how effectively was it run, and was it led or managed effectively and as it was supposed to be. So, in this brief introduction, I tried to cover as many points and as many relevant points that I could come up with for you to understand this is not a course on assessment and measurement. This is an introduction. This is not a course on assessment and measurement. This is an introduction to a philosophical point of view. Remember the tree in the forest? I get back to it once more. How do we know that we did well or horribly? What I introduced to you here in this unit were a few approaches and ways to come to terms with the idea of assessing where we are, where we were, and where we're going to. Using evidence-based practice in education is probably one of the most important points in our educational practice. We have to remember that the way we choose practices, interventions, measures, etc., the way is based on our assumption that we choose elements, tools, measures that enjoy support from evidence that they actually work, that there's ample evidence or enough evidence to suggest they're not totally rubbish. They do something. But in science, like always in science, we doubt. The fact that it worked once well somewhere does not mean that we can apply it without a doubt in our mind. Therefore, everything we do and anything we do needs to be followed with measurement and assessment, so we are sure, or at least better informed, as to whether we attained our goals successfully or not. It was a pleasure having you here. I hope you've learned something new. See you next time.